Bernie Madoff did not look like a man hiding in the shadows. He looked exactly like the kind of man the financial world was built to trust. A former chairman of Nasdaq, a fixture of Wall Street, polished, connected, established. Nothing about him suggested panic. Nothing about him suggested chaos. Nothing about him suggested fraud. That was the first problem. Because Madoff did not sell fantasy. He sold discipline. He sold restraint. He sold the feeling that somewhere beneath the noise of the market, one man had found a calmer system. And for years, that was enough. Enough for banks, enough for billionaires, enough for charities, fund managers, and retirees. Enough to make people stop asking the one question that mattered: who actually checked? Most Ponzi schemes announce themselves with greed. They promise too much, too fast, too loudly. Madoff understood something more sophisticated. Wild promises create suspicion. Stability creates trust. So he offered something that felt almost conservative: steady returns year after year through rising markets and falling ones, through volatility, panic, and recession. That consistency did not alarm people. It reassured them. He did not need to chase investors. In many cases, investors chased him. Access to Bernie Madoff was treated less like a transaction and more like admission into a private circle. Sometimes, clients were made to feel lucky to be accepted. Sometimes they were kept waiting. Sometimes they were told no. And that exclusivity deepened the illusion. Because once an opportunity feels rare, people spend less time testing it and more time trying to deserve it. And many of the people whose money ended up with Madoff never made that decision themselves. They handed it to intermediaries, private bankers, fund managers, feeder funds, professionals who were supposed to do the work ordinary investors could not do on their own. The research, the scrutiny, the due diligence. That, at least, was the assumption. In reality, vast sums were passed into Madoff's operation through layers of financial respectability. The names changed, the paperwork changed, the fees were collected. But again and again, the core act stayed the same. Money went in, questions did not. That is one of the darkest features of the case. Madoff was not protected only by secrecy. He was protected by delegation, by the comforting belief that someone else, somewhere higher up the chain, had already verified everything. But not everyone was convinced. One of the earliest and most persistent skeptics was Harry Markopolos, a financial analyst who looked at Madoff's reported strategy and saw something deeply wrong. He ran the numbers, then ran them again, and again. Each time, he reached the same conclusion. The performance being reported did not make sense. Not in rough terms, not in technical terms, not in mathematical terms. The returns were too smooth, too consistent, too detached from the real behavior of the market. So he warned the SEC, not once, for years. He submitted analysis, arguments, evidence, red flags. He laid out why the operation should have triggered immediate suspicion. And still, the system failed to stop it. Investigations happened. Questions were asked. Meetings were held. But the deeper challenge was never fully absorbed. Because by then, Madoff's reputation had become part of the evidence in his favor. He did not have to prove he was legitimate. His status kept doing that for him. That is what makes this story larger than one fraud.
Bernie Madoff was not simply lying about returns. He was exploiting a reflex, a human reflex, an institutional reflex. The tendency to relax when authority looks polished enough. The tendency to confuse prestige with proof. The tendency to believe that a serious face, a serious office, and a serious resume must be standing on serious foundations. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they are standing on nothing. The illusion held for years. Then came 2008. The financial crisis did what regulators, analysts, and gatekeepers had failed to do. It forced reality into the room. As markets convulsed, investors wanted their money back. Redemption requests grew. The pressure mounted. The structure could no longer hold. The machinery of the fraud had always depended on motion. New money arriving, old withdrawals covered, confidence preserved. Once that flow broke, so did the story. And then, in a private conversation with his sons, Bernie Madoff finally stripped the performance down to its barest truth. It's all one big lie. That sentence did not only expose a fraud, it detonated thousands of lives. Because the victims were not abstract numbers on a balance sheet. They were families, retirees, small investors, employees of charities, people who had built entire futures around the belief that their savings were in the safest hands available. Some lost comfort, some lost dignity, some lost any realistic chance to recover. And the cultural memory of the scandal still tends to drift upward toward the famous names, the major banks, the elite institutions. But the full weight of the disaster was often carried lower down, by people old enough to need security and too old to rebuild from scratch. What followed was not a clean ending. It was a long, brutal, legal salvage operation. Irving Picard, the trustee appointed to recover money for victims, pursued a strategy that made the aftermath morally complicated as well as legally historic. He did not only go after the obvious architects of the fraud, he also pursued those who had withdrawn more than they put in, those who had profited from fictitious gains, those whose money came out early enough to leave someone else trapped at the end. That meant the search for justice did not move in a straight line between innocent victims and guilty conspirators. It moved through a far more uncomfortable landscape, a world in which people could benefit from a lie without understanding it, a world in which financial profit itself became contaminated by the system that produced it. And in that sense, even the recovery effort preserved the central horror of the case. The fraud had spread so deeply that there was no painless way to unwind it. In the end, Bernie Madoff was not protected by genius, he was protected by recognition, by status, by access, by the silent transfer of trust from one respected name to another. And that may be the most disturbing part of the story. Not that one man lied, but that so many people at every level found reasons not to look too closely. The scheme was enormous. The damage was historic. The warning signs were real. And still, the image held. Until it didn't. Fraud survives longest when credibility becomes a substitute for verification.